This morning I was going to launch a theme for the year, but I've decided to hold off for one more week, given that so many of our folk are away for the long weekend. They're little slackers if you're watching this at home. One of them being my daughter, who's away camping. But I decided to hold off for one extra week. We're going to do it next weekend. And seriously, the theme that we're launching is going to be a year-long theme, so one less week isn't going to make much of a difference in the overall scheme of things. Now, I would encourage you, though, to be here next weekend as we launch that theme. We have some exciting announcements to make as well. There is the possibility, the very strong possibility, that we'll be adding a new staff member to our church, an assistant pastor. And I'm really excited about that. So that announcement will maybe get made next weekend. So you'll just have to come along and find out if it does. So instead of talking about the future this morning, I'm going to talk about the past. Hence the topic of my message today, looking to the past in order to understand and walk wisely in the present. This year, 2024, marks my 35th year in pastoral ministry. And I'm going to ask you to indulge me a little as I look back over the last 35 years and reflect on some of the things that stand out for me about a life intersected with serving Jesus. Hopefully you'll gain some personal benefit from what you hear, and at the least it should make for some interesting lunchtime conversation. After 2 years of Bible college in Townsville, following my discharge from the Australian Army, this is my son and my daughter. I moved to Tassie with two friends from Bible college to plant a church in Belrive here on the Eastern Shore. During the next 5 years, I assisted in planting our church, pioneered a youth program, completed a Bachelor of Education, and best of all, married Deb. The next 4 years were spent in Brisbane, where Aidan and Caitlin were born, and where I started as a youth pastor and then moved into an assistant pastor's role at Albany Hills AHE. We then moved to Townsville in 1997, where we took on a 9-month-old church, Northern Beaches Community Church, and experienced what the life of senior pastors was like for the very first time. Whilst I'd worked for senior pastors for the previous 9 years of my ministry experience, there's nothing like doing it yourself to understand what it's all about. Whilst we were in Townsville, Ryan was added to our family, and then around 9 months later, God very clearly said our time was up. That's 9 months after Ryan was born, not 9 months after we got there. 9 months later, God very clearly made it very clear to us that our time was up and we were to leave Townsville and head back to Tassie. We arrived back in Tassie from Townsville, North Queensland, in the middle of winter, 2001. And I think some of you have heard some of the things that Aidan said at that time. He was only 5 when we came back here. And the first thing he said was, "Mum and Dad, are we ever going to live in Australia again?" I said, "No, this is Australia." And then in April, so we moved back in the middle of June. And then in April the next year he says to me, "Dad, when's summer?" And I said, and he was serious, he was dead serious. He said, "Dad, when's summer?" I said, "Mate, we've had summer." We're right away back out to winter again. So we arrived right in the middle of winter. In April of and the next year, after 2001, in 2002, I was invited onto the team here at Grace as the associate pastor, and in April of 2004, I was inducted as the new senior pastor, and here we are 20 years later. The year, I only just realised this last night, and I stuck it into my notes. The year that I became senior pastor was also the year that Erin was born. So I know how many years I've been the senior pastor of Grace whenever I look at my daughter, because she was born then. It's helpful when you're early childhood trained. Now, there have been a number of things that I've learned over the years, and the number one thing that stands out for me is that God is real. Now, the reason I say that is because the miracle that I've seen in the church, whether that be here in Tassie, Brisbane or Townsville, wouldn't have been possible if it was dependent upon the strength and the talents of the people involved. And let me be very clear here. I've worked with some incredibly talented people during that time. I still do. I'm not trying to be all falsely humble or downplay anyone's contribution. I'm just stating a fact that I've become completely convinced of whilst reflecting on my own life, and in particular this last season that we have been in here at Grace. The things that I've seen happen over the last 35 years could only have happened if God was at work behind the scenes orchestrating events. As I just mentioned, I took on my role of Senior Pastor of Grace in 2004, and for the next 7 years we experienced a season of growth and renewal that was the envy of most other churches in our city. We were seeing 17% growth every year. We went from 200 to 600 people in our church. We were running 2 services each Sunday morning, and we started to contemplate whether we should add a 3rd service. We decided it wouldn't be good for our leaders to carry that type of load, so we started to look for a larger premises outside of the city centre and made an offer on some land in Cambridge, which was accepted. At the same time, we decided to move across the river ahead of building. And to that end, we ended up hiring Citywide Baptist Church on a Sunday afternoon so we could hold services at 4 p.m. During that time, I was the state president of our movement here in Tassie and had the privilege of developing some significant relationships with key church leaders around our nation. You could probably say, looking back at that time, that we were flying high. But God had plans that required a change in direction that was a complete right angle to the trajectory we were on, and a transformation of our hearts that would prepare us for the people He would send us to. That whole process ended up with us landing here in Rugby rather than Cambridge, with a much smaller church than we had when we crossed the river. I was no longer the state president, as I'd given up that role so that I could focus more on our church during our challenging Mornington season. Gus had cut way back on his hours as he moved more into chaplaincy, and we had just purchased an old wreck of a building that had potential from the outside, but had multiple hidden issues that we only discovered after moving in. However, having said all of that, I'd never go back to where we were in the past if it meant losing what we currently have now. And that's something that I could not have predicted back when we were having to make all of those decisions. Why is that? Because we probably would never have been forced to grapple with the words of Jesus the way we have over the past 13 years. We wouldn't have arrived at such a clear understanding on the call on the local church to reach the poor, the marginalised, the oppressed and the forgotten. And we definitely wouldn't have our current engagement with our local community if we built an auditorium in Cambridge. You see, if you follow conventional wisdom, you won't necessarily end up where God wants you to. It's a faith walk, and faith is built on trust. And to trust God means learning to die to self and to keep on keeping on, or as the Bible puts it, to persevere. In Psalm 37, 23 and 24, the Lord directs the steps of the godly. He delights in every detail of their lives. Though they stumble, they will never fall, for the Lord holds them by the hand. I've always had an unshakable belief that God has been leading us on the path that we need to take. And every challenging detour in that road has been specifically designed by God to change our hearts so that we're prepared for what's up ahead. Now, I've always believed that God will get us to where He needs us to be, and in my darkest hours, and I've had some pretty tough times over the last 13 years, especially when considering the stuff that wasn't happening around us at times. In my darkest hours, that flame has never gone out. That hope has never gone out. I've always believed that God will get us to where we need to be through the ups and the downs, which is why I think we've been able to, it's why I believe I've been able to persevere in the role that I've had, given our past and where we are today. Now, so that's a ministry lesson that I've learned as I follow Jesus' call to the church and to the broader community. God is real, and when you stay true to him, he will get you through. Now, for something a bit more personal, I personally have never done well with personal conflict. Growing up in a family with an alcoholic dad birthed a deep-seated fear inside of me of conflict and the pain that it caused to those around. And very early on as a kid, I learned how to read a room really well. And so what would happen is I would enter, might be the lounge room, Dad might be in there with Mum or one of the other, my brother, one of my other siblings, and if I sensed that there was any tension or any conflict or anything brewing under the surface, I would then become whatever I needed to be to try and diffuse the situation. I became an expert, as I said, at reading the room and minimising conflict. On the surface, I looked like everything was okay, but underneath, I was a hot mess. That's how things started for me. That was when I entered into adulthood. That's the type of person that I was, but I'm not like that anymore. And for me, it's one of the biggest miracles of my life. Now, I'm definitely not perfect. You can just ask Deb, she'll tell you. You see the good me every Sunday here at church. I'm definitely not perfect. And I think that this area will always be a challenge and a struggle for me. But it's far, far less controlling than it used to be. It's been the area that I've had to trust God the most in over the years because it deals with the actions of others, something that is completely out of my control, your control, our control. Yep. And over years of surrendering that part of my life to God, I've seen a gradual change happen on the inside. But it didn't take place overnight. That said, it did take place over time. Now, the reason that I share that is because when it comes to the work of God in our lives, I've noticed something interesting. And that is that God seems to work in moments. There's my kids again. And in years. There are encounters that I've had with God that have changed me in a moment of time. For example, the baptism of the Holy Spirit totally changed my life. And then there are things that have taken a long time of faithful service to see come to pass. When you look at the disciples of Jesus and their journey with him, we see that over the 3 years that they were with him, there was a gradual change in their relationship and their understanding of who he was. But it wasn't until the moment that they saw him alive after the resurrection that their worlds changed forever. Now, in life, those moments are few and far between, but they're incredibly precious. They're also instigated by God according to his unfolding plan and his timetable, and that's really important to know. They're not as dependent on your faithfulness as much as on the nature of God and his faithfulness in our lives. Now, if you're not careful, you can live your entire life seeking after those sorts of experiences and completely miss what is happening in you and through you in the present. Moments aren't where your faithfulness shines the brightest, but rather it's the years in between that prove your heart. Moments can come on the back end of years of faithfulness and can be missed when we're unfaithful. I like to think about it this way. We're responsible for the years. God is responsible for the moments. And the reason why I like to think about it like that is because I don't see people falling away from God in the high moments of their experience with Him. But I do see people walking away from God during the years in between, when things get tough, when things get hard. If you walk humbly with God long enough, you will see incredible change happen on the inside. It's why James tells us to persevere, because over time it changes us and causes us to mature. It's why Paul says not to grow weary in doing good, because it takes time to reap a harvest. There are certain foods and drink that increase in flavour, value and taste as they're aged. Wines and certain cheeses come to mind. Aged versions cost way more than regular versions of them and are used for special occasions. But before that happens, they're hidden away for the aging process to take place. And the longer they're aged, the greater the flavour and value. So if you have a weakness or a hidden trauma, something that you feel controls your life in a negative way, bring it to Jesus each and every day. Let it humble your heart and bring you to that place of sitting at His feet over and over again. And don't get discouraged when you fail. It takes a long time to change a person on the inside. But if you sit regularly at the feet of Jesus, you give Him access to your world, and that change occurs. Every time you sit at the feet of Jesus, change is happening. It's slow. Most of life is. And then it's quick. I remember when someone from our church came and visited me at the Grace Centre just after our offices were completed. Our offices look a little bit different to this picture on here. This is what they looked like when we first built them. We've now since put a wall across here and made that other room into a much larger meeting space, but it's now closed off. But this is what our offices looked like when we first finished them at the end of, was it 2019, I think? 2019? Does that make sense? 2018? I don't know. It was a long time. It was a while ago, all right? But anyway, they came and visited me at the Grace Centre, and they were completely amazed at all of the changes that had occurred. And they commented how quickly it had all happened. They said, oh, wow, this has happened quick. Internally, though, I was thinking it was 783 work days, 3 very long years, before our lovely offices were complete. And before that, on every one of those days, we worked out of a dump. 783 work days. That's not including holidays, not including weekends. 783 work days. That's a long time. Imagine if somebody said to you, well, Christmas is coming, but it's going to be 3 years away. Your birthday's coming, but it's 3 years away. You want that new phone? You can have it, but it'll happen in 3 years' time. You think that's a long, long time. The truth of the matter is, when you look back on it, though, it does seem quick. But in reality, it took a very long time. Now, the Bible is a bit like that. When you're reading it, it jumps from highlight to highlight. So you lose sense of the long amounts of time spent between the mountaintops. Is it no wonder that one of the 2 commendations that the Master gives to the good servants is faithful? Well done, good and faithful servant. God values your faithfulness, not for His own benefit, but for the benefit it brings to your life. So, in concluding my message this morning, here is my final statement. God is real and can be trusted to get you to where you need to be. And change will happen if you remain faithful over the years. Let's pray.